In the fall of 1954, Meadow Ridge Elementary was just another quiet rural school tucked in the hills of western Pennsylvania. Children recited their morning pledges, teachers marked attendance on chalkboards, and the old furnace in the basement rattled the way it always did as winter approached. Yet beneath this peaceful routine lay a mystery that would haunt the town for generations. On the morning of October 18th, Janitor Russell "Rusty" Dalka, a 52-year-old widower known for fixing everything from broken lockers to bird nests stuck in gutters, vanished without leaving so much as a footprint behind. His keys remained on their hook. His work cart stood untouched in the hallway. And despite a week-long search, not a single clue emerged. The community refused to let the story fade. Parents, former students, and retired teachers passed the tale down like folklore. The janitor who walked into the school and never walked out. 70 years later, a collapsed section beneath the property forced crews to reopen a long-sealed coal shaft, and what they discovered 30 feet below would rewrite everything Meadow Ridge thought it knew about that day. This is the chilling account of the 1954 school mystery. The morning of October 18, 1954, began like any other at Meadow Ridge Elementary School. A thin veil of frost clung to the grass, making the playground glisten under the soft gray light of dawn. Inside the school, the familiar scent of oiled wood floors and chalk dust lingered in the quiet corridors, a calm before the daily burst of children's voices. As always, the first footsteps in the building belonged to Russell "Rusty" Dalka, the janitor who kept the aging school alive through decades of harsh winters, leaky roofs, and persistent boiler troubles. For 17 years, Rusty's routine had been clockwork. He arrived at the school at 5:15 a.m. sharp, hung his coat on the same hook, checked the furnace pressure, and then walked the hallways with his old metal flashlight, ensuring everything was in order before teachers arrived. He was dependable to the point that staff used his arrival time as a natural alarm. "If Rusty's not here, something's wrong," the principal often joked. But on this morning, something was wrong, only no one realized it yet. At 5:18 a.m., a delivery driver named Milton Hauer passed the front of the school and noticed Rusty's truck parked in its regular spot. That told investigators later that Rusty had arrived on schedule. But what happened after he locked his truck and walked inside would remain invisible for nearly 70 years. Sometime between 5:20 and 5:25, Rusty was heard in the basement by the boiler room. Mrs. Gloria Tanner, the second-grade teacher who liked to arrive early, said she heard what she assumed were Rusty's boots on the metal stairs. "He always stomped twice before stepping onto the basement landing," she recalled. "I heard the double stomp. I'd swear by it." But when she passed the basement door at 6 a.m. to greet him, as she often did, there was no sound at all. She assumed he had moved on to another part of the school. At 7 a.m., the first wave of teachers arrived. The principal, Mr. Howard Lively, noticed Rusty's janitorial cart neatly placed at the end of the east hallway. The mop was rinsed, the cleaning cloth folded, and his ring of keys hung in its usual spot beside the staff break room door. Nothing was out of place except one small detail: Rusty himself was nowhere to be found. At 7:23 a.m., a cafeteria worker named June Matthews realized the furnace hadn't been checked. The pressure gauge was lower than usual, something Rusty never overlooked. She called out his name twice, no response. By 8 a.m., students were flooding the halls, lunchboxes clattering, shoes squeaking across lanolin-polished floors. Teachers continued searching casually for Rusty, not yet alarmed but increasingly confused. Normally, he greeted everyone in the morning. That day his absence began to feel off. The first real concern came at 8:45 a.m. when the bell rang and Principal Lively gathered the faculty for a brief meeting. "Has anyone seen Rusty this morning?" he asked. The room exchanged uncertain looks. No one had. They checked his truck again, still there. They checked his coat, still on the hook. They checked his small office, a broom, a coffee cup still half full from the day before, and a radio sitting quietly on the shelf. Everything suggested Rusty had begun his shift like normal. Everything except the missing man himself. At 9:12 a.m., Lively decided to search the basement thoroughly. The furnace rumbled the way it always did, spewing its earthy coal smell into the air. The tools were neatly arranged. The maintenance logs were untouched. And the only unusual detail was one that would make sense decades later: a faint draft of cold air coming from behind the old supply shelves near the far west wall. At the time, the draft was dismissed as part of the building's aging ventilation. By 9:40 a.m., concern became worry. Rusty wasn't the sort of man to leave his duties unattended, especially with the winter furnace running. He was meticulous, serious, and deeply committed to the old building. Teachers often said the school functioned only because Rusty treated it like a living thing that needed constant care. At 10:03 a.m., Lively contacted the sheriff's office. Deputies arrived by 10:30, and they immediately began interviewing staff. Their timeline reconstructed that Rusty entered the building sometime around 5:15. They found no signs of a struggle, no open doors, no broken windows. Rusty's toolbox was untouched. His work logbook had a single note written the previous afternoon: "Check west basement wall airflow next morning." At the time, no one knew how important that note would become. By noon, the school was in quiet panic. Parents were notified that a staff member had gone missing, though details were light. Students noticed the tension in teachers' voices. Rumors started almost immediately. A runaway student had lured Rusty somewhere. Rusty slipped on the stairs. Rusty had a secret exit. Rusty had enemies. None of it was true, but the mystery made space for imagination. By 3 p.m., the sheriff's office declared the building fully searched. Rusty's absence was now a formal missing persons case. One detail haunted investigators: no footprints leading away from the school were found. Rain from the previous night made the surrounding mud soft enough to hold a print clearly. Yet all they found were the tire marks from Rusty's truck, and no trace of his boots leaving the property. It was as if he had walked inside the school and simply vanished. In the weeks that followed, locals whispered that the school was built on strange land. Old coal mines from the 1900s ran beneath many rural Pennsylvania towns, often forgotten and undocumented. But at the time, no one connected Rusty's disappearance with anything beneath the school. Why would they? The tunnels had been believed sealed for decades. But Rusty himself had sensed something unusual. That last note in his logbook, "Check west basement wall airflow next morning," hinted he had discovered something no one else noticed. A thin current of cold air from behind a wall that, in theory, should have been solid brick. It would take 70 years, a collapsing foundation, and a team of modern engineers to discover what Rusty found that morning, and what ultimately trapped him 30 feet underground. The first official search for Rusty Dalka began shortly after the sheriff's office declared him missing on the afternoon of October 18, 1954. Meadow Ridge was a small rural community, tight-knit, quiet, and stubbornly proud of its self-sufficiency. When word spread that the school janitor had vanished without explanation, people didn't wait for instructions. Parents left work early, farmers closed their shops, and by sunset, nearly half the town had turned up around the school grounds, offering any help they could. Sheriff Walter Brenner, a stoic man who'd served in World War II and believed strongly in maintaining order, divided the volunteers into groups. They began with the most obvious assumption: Rusty must have walked off the property, maybe distressed, sick, or injured. So they combed the fields behind the school, checking drainage ditches and tree lines, calling his name in steady intervals. Nothing. By 6:45 p.m., the sun dipped behind the hills, and the October cold crept in quickly. Deputies brought lanterns, and the search pushed outward in widening circles. Some searched the old roads leading out of town. Others asked nearby homeowners if they'd seen Rusty that morning. Not a single person reported anything unusual. What bothered Sheriff Brenner most was the evidence that pointed to one conclusion: Rusty had never left the building on foot. The soft, wet ground around the school told the story clearly. The only footprints found belonged to students and teachers arriving after 7 a.m. Rusty's boots, if they had crossed the mud, would have left deep impressions, yet none were there. Brenner stood near Rusty's truck for nearly 10 minutes, examining every detail. The driver's door was locked. The toolbox behind the seat was still pushed into its corner. There were no fingerprints out of the ordinary, no sign of haste, and nothing to suggest Rusty left in a hurry. At 7:20 p.m., Brenner ordered the search to move inside. The building, now eerily silent without children, took on a different energy at night. The long corridors stretched into shadows, and the aging radiators clanked like slow footsteps. Deputies started with the classrooms, opening cabinets, checking under desks, scanning the floors for any sign of a struggle. They found nothing but chalk-stained erasers, forgotten lunch pails, and scattered worksheets. The cafeteria was next. June Matthews, the cafeteria worker who noticed the furnace hadn't been checked that morning, watched anxiously as officers opened the pantry and storage rooms. Rusty wasn't there either. At 8:05 p.m., they entered the basement. The basement at Meadow Ridge Elementary was a sprawling, dimly lit space built when the school still relied heavily on coal heat. Much of it had been abandoned in the 1930s, replaced by newer sections, but parts of the old foundation still remained. The furnace room roared with its usual mechanical heartbeat, pumping heated air through the vents. Brenner led the search personally. He had a nagging thought he couldn't shake. Rusty had been heard down here early that morning. If anything strange happened, this was the most likely place. The basement search lasted nearly an hour. Deputies opened storage closets, inspected the furnace, moved stacked crates, and even lifted floor grates to check for openings. One deputy, a young man named Harlan Pierce, noted a draft coming from the west wall, faint but undeniable. He told Brenner. Brenner wrote it in his notebook, but dismissed it as airflow from an older vent system. That detail, insignificant at the time, would become crucial decades later. By 9 p.m., they completed the basement sweep. No trace of Rusty. At 9:30 p.m., after searching every accessible part of the school, Sheriff Brenner reluctantly suspended the search for the night. The temperature dropped below freezing. There was no sign Rusty was anywhere in the surrounding fields or the building. Volunteers reluctantly went home. Teachers whispered to one another, unable to comprehend how a man could simply disappear. But Brenner had seen something like this before, back in 1947, when a miner went missing in an old coal seam outside town. It took 3 days to find him trapped beneath a collapsed section. Brenner wondered, privately, if Meadow Ridge School might hide something beneath its foundation no one had considered. Early the next morning, the sheriff's office resumed the search. They brought in bloodhounds from a nearby county. If Rusty had walked out, the dogs would know. The handlers began at Rusty's truck, giving the dogs one of his work gloves to scent. The dogs circled the vehicle twice, pawed the ground, sniffed the grass, and then, strangely, pulled toward the school entrance. Inside the lobby, the dogs paced, turned in circles, and then led their handlers toward the basement stairwell. Each dog reacted the same way. They descended the stairs, walked to the center of the furnace room, then stopped, whining softly. The scent didn't lead out of the basement. It simply ended there. This finding shocked everyone. Dogs rarely make such definitive stops unless the trail is cut off abruptly, by air movement, sealed space, or death. Deputies expanded the search area around the school. They inspected the exterior foundation, crawled under the building where possible, and even checked the storm drains. Nothing pointed to an exit route. By noon, rumors began circulating loudly across town. Some believed Rusty had suffered a medical emergency and fallen somewhere hidden. Others whispered darker theories, that someone had harmed him. A few superstitious locals even blamed the land itself, claiming the school sat on bad ground left over from turn-of-the-century mining. On the third day, a retired coal surveyor named Lewis Fenton approached Sheriff Brenner with a map he had kept for decades. It showed old mining shafts carved beneath the town, including one labeled Vertical Maintenance Shaft Number 6, approximately under the western part of the school's foundation. But according to the town records, shaft number 6 had been permanently sealed in 1928. Without evidence to the contrary, the theory was dismissed. By the end of the week, Rusty's disappearance transitioned from an urgent search to an open missing persons case. Meadows Ridge Elementary reopened under a cloud of unease. Students avoided the basement stairs. Teachers walked in pairs. Parents waited anxiously at the front doors each morning, scanning for any sign of renewed investigations. Weeks turned to months. Posters faded. Interest dimmed. Without new leads, the sheriff could only revisit old evidence, re-interview the same staff, and wonder how a man could vanish inside a school with no witnesses, no exit, and no trace. The official search ended with the same chilling conclusion. Rusty Dalka walked into Meadow Ridge Elementary on the morning of October 18, 1954. And not a single person alive could explain how he never walked out. What no one knew was that the answer was buried beneath their feet, behind a forgotten wall, down a blocked vertical shaft, and 30 feet underground where Rusty spent his final hours. By the early 2000s, Meadow Ridge Elementary was considered an aging but functional school, its pipes noisy, its lighting dim, its hallways slightly uneven from decades of settling. Most of the staff assumed the basement was the oldest part of the building. But the truth was far stranger. The school had been constructed on top of layers of earlier structures built long before anyone currently living had been born. To understand Rusty's disappearance, the town had to rediscover a history it had forgotten. The school's original foundation, and what lay beneath. When Meadow Ridge Elementary was first built in 1906, the region relied entirely on coal. Many rural Pennsylvania towns carved tunnels, shafts, and underground passages beneath public buildings. Some served as coal delivery routes. Others were maintenance corridors, meant to allow workers to access furnace equipment without disrupting classrooms. By the 1920s, these shafts had been officially sealed as the school upgraded to newer systems. But sealed, in the early 20th century, often meant nothing more than wooden boards, iron sheets, or piles of rubble packed into an opening. Over time, these improvised barriers were forgotten, replaced, or walled over entirely. When Rusty disappeared in 1954, the building had already been remodeled twice. Each renovation pushed old blueprints further into storage, buried beneath layers of paperwork and dust. The staff who worked there in the 1950s didn't even know the school had once had 4 separate basement sections, only 2 of which were still in use. One of those forgotten sections, an abandoned coal service shaft, ran beneath the west side of the basement, the very place Rusty had written about in his final maintenance note. The rediscovered blueprints. In 1997, after decades of declining enrollment, the district began discussing possible renovations. Some teachers joked that if they removed one more ceiling tile, the whole system would collapse into a pile of dust. During this planning phase, a local historian named Henry Mulligan stumbled upon a stack of rolled-up blueprints in the archives of the county records office. They were heavily yellowed, the edges frayed, but still legible. At first glance, they appeared to depict the school's 1906 design. But as Henry unrolled the larger sheets, he noticed something that should have been impossible: a vertical square labeled Service Drop Shaft Number 6, 30 feet, drawn beneath the school's western foundation. This was the same shaft that the retired surveyor Lewis Fenton had told Sheriff Brenner about back in 1954, the one the state insisted had been sealed properly. But Henry noticed something else. A narrow line extended from the shaft and connected with a room labeled Coal Chute Access Corridor, a room that didn't appear on any modern plans. In other words, there had been an access route that no one alive remembered. Why no one connected it in 1954? During the search for Rusty, deputies scanned the basement but never moved the large, heavy shelving units bolted to the west wall. Those shelves were installed in 1929, after shaft number 6 had supposedly been sealed. To the search teams in 1954, The wall behind those shelves looked solid. No cracks, no gaps, no seams. But the 1906 blueprints revealed that what now appeared to be a solid wall had originally been a maintenance opening, later filled in and bricked over. Worst of all, the blueprints showed that the seam between the old and new foundation stones passed directly behind the west shelving unit. Rusty, being the school's janitor, had worked in that basement for 17 years. He knew the building intimately. He was familiar with every draft, every vibration, every odd sound in the mechanical rooms. So when he wrote in his logbook, "Check west basement wall airflow," he was likely the first person in decades to notice the faint breeze leaking through the forgotten seam. He was standing in front of the west wall that morning. He likely touched the shelves, felt the cold air, and began to investigate. He didn't know he was standing in front of a concealed entrance to a vertical drop shaft. The construction that hid the truth. In 1928, when the coal system was decommissioned, the district hired workers to seal the shaft. But the records, rediscovered in 1997, were vague. The notes simply read, "Shaft 6 filled, secured with rubble and crossbeam." But what no one realized was that the rubble had shifted over time. The weight of the school above compressed the fill, creating air pockets deep below. The wooden beams that braced the blockage had deteriorated. Even a minor disturbance, like a person pressing on a weakened section, could have caused part of the fill to collapse. And that is exactly what happened in 1954. The sound no one understood. During later testimony, one teacher, a young woman named Carla Weaver, said she remembered hearing a heavy, muffled thud around 5:30 a.m. the morning Rusty vanished. She assumed it was the furnace sputtering or Rusty dropping something. But that sound was later determined to be the initial collapse of the shaft opening as Rusty stepped onto a weakened patch of the repaired floor. The forgotten corridor. In 2003, when renovation crews first began preliminary inspections, they accidentally drilled into a hollow space behind the west wall. At first, they assumed it was a ventilation cavity. But as they widened the opening, they discovered a 5-foot-wide corridor. Walls reinforced with early 1900s brick. Coal residue still clinging to the floor. And at the end of the corridor, a vertical shaft sealed roughly halfway up with compacted debris. Workers reported feeling a strong downward draft, cold, dry air flowing from somewhere far below. It matched the exact airflow Rusty had noted on the last morning of his life. Why it took 70 years to understand. Coal shafts were rarely documented consistently. Many were dug quickly, sealed quickly, and forgotten quickly. As communities modernized, they treated underground infrastructure as relics rather than hazards. Meadow Ridge Elementary, built over one such relic, carried that ignorance for decades. When the shaft was finally reopened in 2024 after a partial foundation collapse, investigators realized how Rusty vanished without a trace. He discovered the corridor. The weakened fill collapsed beneath him. He fell approximately 30 feet into the vertical shaft. The collapse sealed the opening behind him almost instantly. He was alive long enough to leave a message. And for 70 years, the building stood quietly above him, hiding a secret no one imagined. Rusty had never left the school grounds. He had been beneath them, waiting to be found. The turning point in a 70-year mystery came not from a new investigation, not from a historian's note, and not from a witness confession, but from the simple force of time itself. In March of 2024, Meadow Ridge Elementary prepared for a long-overdue renovation project. The school board had finally secured state funding to address structural issues, replace outdated plumbing, and modernize the heating system. No one expected the project to uncover anything unusual. After all, the building had been standing for more than a century. It had its quirks, but it had always endured. That changed on the morning of March 19, 2024, when workers noticed an unusual sag in the west side of the basement floor. At first, they assumed it was typical settling, wooden beams softening, concrete shifting. But as the crew unloaded materials, A loud crack echoed through the basement, sharp and hollow, as if something under the floor had snapped. Foreman David Ruzek, a veteran contractor with 30 years of experience, halted all activity immediately. "That didn't sound like concrete," he later said. "That sounded like a chamber giving way." He ordered all workers out. Minutes later, a section of the floor, roughly 6 feet wide, suddenly caved inward. Dust billowed upward, filling the basement with a gritty haze. When the air settled, the crew gathered at a safe distance and peered into the opening. Below them yawned a dark cavity, deeper than any utilities tunnel should be. The crew contacted the district, and by noon, a structural engineer from the state arrived to assess the damage. The engineer shined a powerful lamp into the hole, expecting to see old pipes or soil. Instead, the light revealed stacked brick walls descending vertically, and about 10 feet down, what looked like a collapsed wooden platform. "What the hell is that?" one worker whispered. The engineer responded with a phrase that would change the course of the investigation. "This is not on any of our plans." Reopening shaft number 6. After reviewing the collapse, the engineer ordered the opening expanded for safety reasons. The crew carefully chipped away at the weakened concrete, enlarging the hole until it revealed the full breadth of the old shaft, its walls made of early 1900s brick, once smooth but now chipped by decades of pressure. A cold draft flowed upward, carrying with it a mineral smell, mixed with something older, something the workers couldn't quite describe. When renovation plans were halted, the county called in a geological survey team to inspect the shaft. Their equipment confirmed what the historian's blueprints had suggested years earlier. This was indeed the long-lost vertical maintenance shaft number 6, listed in documents from 1906 and allegedly sealed in 1928. But the seal had clearly failed. The collapse had opened a path downward, exposing old rubble and timber that once blocked the shaft, now reduced to a slanted pile of debris about 30 feet below. No one expected what they would find next. Initial descent and the first discovery. On March 22nd, 3 days after the collapse, a specialized recovery team arrived from Harrisburg. Their job was to rappel into the shaft, assess its stability, and determine if it posed a hazard to the school. The team consisted of experienced urban rescuers, used to navigating abandoned factories and century-old infrastructures. At 9:14 a.m., the first rescuer, identified as Adam Kell, secured his harness and lowered himself into the shaft. What he saw at the bottom would later be described as one of the most haunting finds in Pennsylvania's architectural history. The bottom was dusty but dry. A broken wooden lantern rested near a mound of collapsed debris. A rusted metal toolbox lay against one wall, its lid bent but still identifiable as mid-century craftsmanship. Adam called up to the team. "There's definitely personal property down here. Someone was here." A second rescuer descended. They began cataloging objects. An enamel mug with faded green paint. A cloth cap flattened by decades of weight. A metal ID plate partially buried in dust. Then they saw it, the unmistakable leather strap of a tool belt. Just as Adam reached toward it, his partner's flashlight illuminated something higher up on the wall, something faint but deliberate, shallow scratches carved into the brick surface. Adam froze. "Hold on, we've got markings." The scratches were arranged in lines and clusters, not random like animal activity, nor accidental like tool scrapes. These were intentional. Human. Word spread quickly to the team above, and within minutes, county officials, the school superintendent, and district maintenance staff crowded the edge of the shaft, listening as Adam described the faint writing. The message on the wall. After photographing the wall and enhancing the images digitally, investigators confirmed it. Rusty Dalka had carved a message into the bricks sometime after falling. It wasn't a long message. Survival carvings rarely are. But it was enough to confirm everything the town had wondered for 7 decades. Near the markings, partially buried beneath rubble, they found human remains. The shaft became a crime scene, not because foul play was suspected, but because the site held historical and forensic importance. Rusty's remains were carefully recovered, along with his personal items, all of which had been preserved in surprisingly good condition due to the dry microclimate of the shaft. Among his belongings was something no one expected: his old metal lunchbox, slightly dented, still containing a thermos and a folded wax paper sandwich wrapper. But the most haunting discovery was a lantern, its glass shattered and its frame twisted, indicating Rusty survived the initial fall and attempted to illuminate the darkness. Reconstructing the collapse. Experts from the Pennsylvania Geological Institute reconstructed what happened. Around 5:20 a.m. on October 18, 1954, Rusty approached the west basement wall after noticing the airflow noted in his logbook. He moved the shelves or reached behind them. His weight or pressure triggered a shift in the deteriorated rubble used to seal the shaft. The makeshift barrier gave way beneath him. Rusty plummeted roughly 28 to 30 feet, landing on the partially rotted wooden platform left from the shaft's original construction. The collapse continued, sealing the opening above him. Rusty awoke in darkness, injured but alive. He lit his lantern and attempted to climb the shaft or dig toward the blocked opening. When he realized the barrier was too thick, he carved a message. Experts determined the air supply would have been limited but not immediately fatal. Rusty might have survived several hours, possibly even longer. The lantern likely provided his last light source. The town's reaction. When news of the discovery reached Meadow Ridge, the community was struck silent. People who had grown up hearing the legend of the vanished janitor found themselves processing the reality that Rusty had been beneath their feet the entire time, lost in an unseen space only a few yards from the classrooms he cared for. Parents came to the school with flowers. Former students cried in their cars. Teachers, young and old, stood at the taped-off hallway in quiet disbelief. Rusty Dalka's story was no longer a mystery. It was now a tragedy, documented through the evidence he left behind and the space that held him for 70 years. The final chapter, however, would reveal something even more heartbreaking: Rusty's last moments, reconstructed through forensic analysis and the carved message that survived with him. The last hour before dawn brought a quiet that felt unnatural, even for a mining town built on silence. Sheriff Eldon Marks stood alone in his office, the coal shaft journal spread open on the desk before him. That brittle notebook, Thomas Greeley's final record, felt heavier than any official report he had written in his 25 years of service. Every line was a window into the janitor's fear, and into something else beneath the school that no man had dared acknowledge. Marks ran a thumb over the darkest page, the one Thomas had written with a shaking hand. Something is moving in the old shaft. Not an animal. Not a man. Breathing doesn't sound right. If anyone finds this, don't come down here. Marks closed his eyes. He had replayed those words for hours. By 6 a.m., the school board, the mayor, and a dozen worried parents were waiting in the town hall. They demanded an explanation. They demanded the truth. But the truth was a thing Marks wasn't sure the town could swallow, not without panic, not without imagining creatures lurking under every floorboard. Still, another discovery forced his hand. At the far end of the shaft recovery site, where deputies had been sifting through debris, one of them, Deputy Clyde Hensley, came rushing into the sheriff's office holding a cloth bundle. "We found this wedged between the lower beams," Clyde said, breathless. "You need to see it." Marks unfolded the cloth slowly. Inside was a school badge, bent, dusted with coal. The name on it was faded, but still legible. Martha Allen. Grade 4. Cumberland Elementary. Marks froze. Martha Allen had gone missing in 1938, 16 years before Thomas died. Her disappearance had never been solved. Her parents moved out of the county a year later, unable to bear the weight of a mystery that haunted their doorstep. And now, her badge was in the same shaft where Thomas Greeley died. Marks felt the room tilt. "Clyde," he said, steadying himself, "did anyone else go down there this morning?" "No one," Clyde replied. It was buried deep, like it had been dragged from somewhere inside the tunnel. Dragged. The word rang in Marks's skull. He knew then that Thomas hadn't simply wandered into the shaft out of curiosity or duty. Something had drawn him down, something he recognized, something he feared, something he thought he could keep contained. The journal pages made more sense now. Thomas had written entries describing faint cries echoing through the old frames, voices he assumed were tricks of air. But one line stood out. Heard a girl calling tonight. Said her name was Martha. I don't know how that's possible. The sheriff sat down heavily. The town didn't have the luxury of pretending now. Something connected Thomas's death to the disappearance 16 years earlier. And that coal shaft, forgotten, sealed, ignored, was not as empty as everyone once believed. Deputy Clyde shifted nervously. What do we tell the parents waiting next door? Marks steadied his breath. We tell them the school stays closed. We tell them nothing else until we finish clearing the shaft. And what if we find more? Clyde asked quietly. Marks looked at Thomas's journal again. We prepare for that possibility. By noon, a rescue and recovery team from the state arrived, 6 men trained in collapsed mine extractions. They brought winches, breathing rigs, portable floodlights, and sonar mapping tools to scan the underground layout. But the most important thing they brought was a question Marks had no answer for. Why was this shaft left open at the bottom? The team leader asked, frowning at the diagram. This map shows a sealed drop-off. But someone tore that out years ago. Marks didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already seen the clawed edges of the broken beams. They weren't cut. They weren't broken by falling rock. They looked pried, as if something inside the mine had forced its way deeper, carving a tunnel that no miner had ever dug. That afternoon, while the town buzzed with speculation, Marks made the decision he had been avoiding since dawn. He would go back down, not to recover evidence, not to chase rumors, but to see, finally and definitively, what Thomas had seen. The second descent into the shaft was different from the first. This time, massive lights illuminated the walls. Ropes, pulleys, and cameras hung like vines around the ladder. A medic waited at the lip of the shaft, and 2 rescue men followed closely behind Marks. The deeper they went, the more the air changed, denser, colder than natural underground drafts. When they reached the bottom, Marks led them toward the side tunnel, the same narrow passage where he'd found Thomas. But something was wrong. The floor had shifted. The coal dust was disturbed, forming a messy sweep across the ground as if someone, or something, had been dragged across it since the last visit. The rescue men exchanged uneasy glances. "Sheriff," one whispered, "I don't like this." Marks lifted the lantern. The beam swept across the walls, then froze. At the far end of the tunnel, the rock face was covered in markings, streaks, handprints, and something else. Thin scratches forming shapes that weren't letters but were unmistakably intentional. One rescuer murmured, These look fresh." Marks stepped closer. His boots crunched over something brittle. He knelt and held the lantern low. Bone. Splinters of tiny bone, no larger than a fingertip. His throat tightened. One rescuer staggered back and crossed himself. "Sheriff, this isn't a natural collapse. This is—" A sound cut him off. A hollow exhale. Slow. Wet. Deep in the tunnel. Marks whipped the lantern toward the darkness. Nothing moved, yet the sound, it didn't stop. It pulsed, as if the tunnel itself was breathing. The lead rescuer grabbed Marks's arm. "We're leaving." "No." Marks nodded once. They retreated fast, boots hammering the ground, breath sharp with fear. And even as they climbed the ladder and the daylight grew brighter above them, the sound echoed up the shaft behind them. Like something following. Like something learning the shape of their escape. Back on the surface, Marks sealed the hatch himself. Not with a lock, not with a board, but with 3 industrial steel bolts driven straight into the concrete. When Clyde approached, pale and trembling, Marks didn't turn to face him. "What did you find?" Clyde asked. Marks spoke without looking away from the sealed hatch. "Not what? Not anymore." He stepped back, wiped the coal from his hands, and said the words that would define the mystery for generations. Whatever killed Thomas, it didn't come from outside that shaft. It came from deeper inside. And it's still down there. The 1954 school mystery wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning. And the shaft had only shown them the beginning. Rusty Dalka never intended to be a legend. He was a quiet man who showed up every morning long before the first student arrived, keeping a fragile building running through hard winters and aging pipes. His disappearance shook Meadow Ridge because it violated the rhythm of a place built on routine and familiarity. But his rediscovery, after 7 decades buried beneath the school he cared for, finally gave his story the ending it deserved. The blocked shaft, the scratched message, and the personal items recovered from 30 feet underground painted a picture of a man who fought to survive and hoped someone would one day understand what happened. And now, thanks to the reopening of the old coal system during modern repairs, the town finally does. Today, a small brass plaque near the school's entrance bears his name. Beneath it reads a simple line chosen by former students he once helped. "Thank you for keeping our school warm." Rusty's mystery was silent for generations. Now, it will never be forgotten.